Morning, this is Terry Etam, the author of The End of Fossil Fuel Insanity.
And our international oil and gas consultant, because he also works in the private sector it's a natural gas company, correct?
That's correct, yeah, just a little guy.
And then he's also a blogger with Public Energy #1. He's a writer for the BOE Report and also an author with The End of Fossil Fuel Insanity, which is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble too, right?
That's correct, yep, both places. Go buy them for Christmas.
That's right. We'll make sure we link it up at the website as well. So, first of all, let's get an international oil update. What's going on up in is it Calgary, Alberta, Canada? You're up in that neck of the woods?
That's where I am, yep. Just not too far over the border from Montana. But what's going on up here? Well, I think, oddly enough, we've all been preoccupied for 2 months just watching your election to see what's going to happen down there. That's probably the biggest news that, as far for energy circles, anyways, is to see what that's all going to shake out like. And I guess, like everyone else, we don't really know yet.
I'm glad you brought that up because I did want to ask you that if you guys do pay attention to the to the U.S. elections, whether it's from the energy side of things or the entertainment side of things, but it sounds like it's actually from the energy side of things first and foremost, huh?
Oh, well, you bring up a good point. It gave the entertainment side gave it a good run for the money this year, but it was, the energy side is pretty important. Well, we have landlocked resources here, so we have a lot of Canada has some of the largest. We're among the, I think, like top 3 in the world for oil reserves. Got huge natural gas reserves, and we can hardly get them to market. We can't get them to any tidewater hardly. There's one pipeline that takes oil to the west coast, none take it to the east coast. So we sell everything to the U.S. That's our world. So we have all of these reserves, and you're our big customer, and it kind of that's how it works. But from an energy perspective, whatever happens down there impacts what happens up here. So.
Well, how about for companies that do work down in the States? Because there's quite a few companies from Canada that's doing business down in the United States, aren't there?
Oh, well, especially since things went so sideways here with the government we've had in for the past half decade. It was quite anti-petroleum. They supported a little bit in some ways, but they're climate change fanatics, and so that's their primary worry. That they realize they can't kill off the oil sector, so they do keep it alive. But that's their bent. So the U.S. side is it's more relevant here almost than anything else. And the cross-border flow of people it's always happened that way. We've had a lot of the big majors like Chevron and Exxon and that big Canadian offices here, and people went back and forth. There's a lot of transfers that would go to Houston and then to Calgary or to California with Chevron or wherever. So it's always been a very, very linked system here. A lot of the equity for oil and gas comes from the U.S., from Texas or New York. Or used to when equity would flow. But so the links are really, really strong.
The thing I was thinking about was you mentioned the transition was pretty quick over the course of a decade of oil and gas kind of being phased out or transition to, I don't know, a lifeline, a blip type of, just a basic beating heart up there, because you mentioned they couldn't get rid of it, but they definitely took it out a bit, put it to where it's a lot more controlled, a lot more regulated, and I don't know if a heartbeat or a blip is the right word, but are there any comparisons there between what the fear of a Biden administration or the Green New Deal and what Canada went through in the last 10 years? Is that a comparison at all, like a 4 times of things to come type of a scenario?
I think it's a forewarning of what I think we were ahead of where you're heading, and if people were paying attention in Canada, maybe they would have seen things like, well, for example, about 2010 to 2013 or so, the oil sands were really taking off. There was like tens of billions of dollars of capital flowing in. new projects were coming on. They're big projects, 50, 70,000 barrel a day projects in the oil sands. And it was, the things were just absolutely humming, probably humming too much. It was like the Permian boom. And now just a sign of how things have changed. There's a company called Tech Resources, which wanted to open up a new oil sands deposit, start mining a new deposit. It's close to the surface in some places, so they can mine it. And they went through an approval process for a couple of years. They spent over $1 billion, I think. And they dotted every I and they crossed every T, and they got every environmental permit. And then it had to go to the federal government for review, who now has a new regulatory regime where they can just decide arbitrarily, up to politicians, whether something's going to pass or not. And they didn't actually make that decision. The company walked away from it. They just said, this just isn't going to happen. We can't see it. So while they were waiting for the government to decide, they just pulled the pin and they just walked away. They ate all that cost just because it's become too challenging. And I think we saw that a bit in the U.S. there with that Atlantic Coast pipeline that got canceled. The company had sunk, I think, again, over $1 billion into it, and they had approvals. The Supreme Court had said, you have the right to go ahead, and they walked away from it anyways. They just said, this is not worth it. So I think that just it's weird. It's easy to say that the tide has turned against oil and gas, but the tide has not turned against oil and gas. Everyone uses it every day. Everyone relies on it every day. Everyone understands it. It's this political movement, which is we see as the tide, but it is successfully blocking everything here in North America anyways. And I think under Biden administration, it's just going to be more of the same for the U.S. until the light bulbs start going on and people start realizing that global consumption is still, as soon as this COVID thing is over, I think it's just going to bounce right back to where it was or even higher. China's right back to consuming all that they ever did and still growing. India's just going to grow. And between China and India, you have almost 3 billion people there, which, and in North America, Canada, and the U.S., we have 400 million. So whatever happens there, it's going to dictate the future of energy. And maybe we won't be producing as much of it in North America here, but they'll get it from somewhere. So
that's what I was wondering, how much of it's just going to be exported now. Like coal. That's pretty much what they've done with coal to try to supplement the market there, is a lot of the coal companies have had to export it to China. So it's still getting burned up and used. It's just that there's a lot more robots in the field doing the mining, and then a lot more exports happening to keep the cost down.
Yeah, and it just quietly slips onto a barge and leaves the country. On our west coast here, British Columbia it's a very green, progressive kind of province, very much like California, just like-minded people like that, and very environmentally conscious, home to a lot of climate activists. British Columbia has a booming coal industry, and it's just very quiet, happens very quietly. They produce the coal, it goes on barges, and it disappears off into the world. Nobody talks about it, but it's, yeah. At the same time, they want to ban fossil fuel or internal combustion engines over there. So they haven't done that yet, but you can see it coming because California did it. So,
boy, you can really see how so much of this is, NIMBY, not in my backyard, and just hiding the smokestack, if you will. Just a lot of it's smoke and mirrors, but lipstick on a pig or whatever you want to call it, and not in my backyard, out of sight, out of mind, and just seems nobody cares then.
As long as you look good, that's the as long as you're and a lot of the activists get mad about that. They get quite angry. They call it greenwashing, where people just act like they're being green and they're not really being green. But that's what even the government institutions are guilty of, like California getting rid of hydrocarbons as fast as it can and no more new gas plants. And San Francisco just said no new natural gas hookups. But they just import their power from other states that use hydrocarbons. So what's but they feel good because they cleaned out their yard, like you say. And as long as somebody else builds the power plants, they're good. So
wanted to ask you about the trees as well. You brought up British Columbia, got me thinking about the industrial forest, where here at the Crude Life, we're doing some assistance with some ESG editorial and content. We're going to be interviewing companies and, kind of helping produce that content for the planting of trees, a network of sustainable forests across the United States. 1,000 trees per state, so 50 states, 1,000 trees, 50,000 trees, 10 million pounds of carbon absorbed at a minimum. And I sent it to you as kind of a hey, take a look at your eyes and tell me what you think, anything, we're missing, that type of thing. And you forwarded me a really interesting article that had to do with an initiative going on in Canada of trying to plant trees, but their hurdle is very different because it has to do with land. Talk to me about the hurdles that you guys are having in Canada, and then we'll talk about the reason for the industrial forest in America. But talk to me about this tree planting issue you guys are having up in Canada.
Sure. Well, and first off, I'd say hats off to you guys for that initiative. I think this is brilliant, and I think I kind of get disgusted by the climate activists because of fear mongering and because they say wind and solar is going to solve everything. But I do think we need a cleaner environment, and we think we need to do whatever we can to reduce emissions and just make the world the more sustainable. That sustainable is a good word, and I think forest is one of the best ways to do that. And I think because everybody wins when you plant forests. It's a good ecosystem for wildlife. It's good for the atmosphere. It produces oxygen. It cleans the air. It's just win all around. So your initiative is like that. There's another one in Canada called Project Forest. I wrote a column about this on the BOE Report where I gave you a high five on November 4th. It was out if anybody wants to go read it. November 4th on the BOE Report. It's called Exciting Developments in the Woods. Tree planting initiatives are just getting on with it, where I just said the organizations like yours and the Canadian one here are just saying, well, let's just make the best of this situation. If we're going green, then literally we'll go green, we'll grow forest. In Canada, it seems kind of weird, but the guy I talked to who's putting together the initiative up here says that one of the challenges is actually finding land on which to plant trees, which you would think is bizarre because Canada's the second biggest country on earth and it's covered in forest. But most of it is government-owned land. There's the land that's in private hands tends to be farmland, and the land that's been cleared by forestry companies, which is quite sizable. There's a huge forestry industry up here, as you might expect. That's their responsibility to reforest that anyway. So it's not like if they go clear a bunch of land, then those companies are responsible for making sure that it gets back to some sort of a natural state. And some species of trees, like poplar, they grow back really quickly on their own. It's not an issue, and then some are need more help to get established again. So there is a lot of science that goes into it too. You can't just plant any kind of tree anywhere. But anyways, in Canada, the amount of land is kind of limited because it's that marginal slice of the pie that's not governmental, but it's not farmland. And anyways, the guy said that it's a bit more of a challenge than you would think to actually find space to plant trees. I don't understand it really, and maybe we need more legislation or something, but it seems like there's all sorts of right-of-ways or urban areas where there's just some big open space that isn't used for anything. Anyway, so we need to rethink it. But I think down there in the United States, I think there's a lot more privately held land. The government land is more the exception than the rule. I know that's a dumb statement, but there's a lot more land in private hands. There's a lot more that can be done down there. So,
well, that's what it sounds like to me, is that it's almost overregulated or over-controlled to where it's too hard to do. It's for something as easy as just planting a tree, for crying out loud.
Well, it is, and it's we get to the point of silliness here. It's like I live in Calgary, and this is an odd little story, but I have 2 trees right alongside the street in my yard. I don't have a big yard, just typical suburban yard, but I've got 30 trees in it because I love trees. And I've got a bunch of spruce trees and 3 birch trees and other stuff. And anyways, 2 of the trees happen to be within 2 meters, which is about 6 feet of the street, and so those are technically city property. And something was wrong with one of the trees, even though we planted them. So I talked to the city, and they said, yeah, we'll send somebody out to repair the tree, which they did, which was great. They sprayed it or something, and they said, if you want to know the city's tree population. They actually have a map of where of how many trees there are in the city. So I went to this website and it says there are like 3 million trees in the city. And I thought, oh, that's really cool. And you can look at a map and see where all the trees are. So I dialed in on my neighborhood, and you can zoom right down to your yard, and I see their map says that there are 2 trees on my lot. But I can look out the window and see that that's dead wrong. There's like 15 times that many trees. But if you ask the city, they'll say, no, there's only 2 trees on your lot, because that's what our inventory says. So they don't even, it's so controlled that they just go by their own records and say that this is what we think it is, and that's the rule, or that's the law, and even if it defies common sense. There's a much bigger story that came out 5 years ago, and I mentioned it in that column that I just wrote. There's a group of scientists in 2015 that there had been a common belief in the scientific world. I'm not sure how broad it was, but in the forestry world, anyway, the academic circles, that the world had about 400 billion trees. And a group of scientists decided to update that estimate because it was kind of old. And so they used modern technology and measurement techniques and aerial footage or whatever, and they decided that, no, that old estimate was wrong. There's actually 3 billion or 3 trillion trees in the world. They're off by a factor of 7. So it boggles my mind that in this day and age they could be that wrong on something, and at the same time telling us what we need to do to get the environment in shape in terms of number of trees. However, having said that, I still think that planting forests is the best way to make everybody happy in this debate. So
I think it's funny that in the amount of time a lot of people are arguing about if they could plant trees or not, you could have planted probably 6 trees.
Exactly. Let them get to work, yeah.
You know, it's just interesting how a lot of that works. Well, what's going on in natural gas up in your neck of the woods? Is it still going to, be a foundation fuel, if you will? I mean, it was certainly, long before Greta Thunberg came along, natural gas was really the next step for the clean hydrocarbon fuel. What's going on?
Well, I think that's still the case, and I think that, there's the anti-fossil fuel crowd is trying to kill natural gas. They're doing everything they can because they say it's just a fossil fuel, just like everything else, and even though it's much cleaner than coal or oil burning or whatever, so that movement is still underfoot. There's a great story that came out last week, and I wrote about it, about Enbridge. I'm not sure if you know Enbridge, but they're a pretty big pipeline company. They're like,
sure,
they're worth well over $100 billion. Yeah. And they took over Spectra in the U.S. a couple of years ago to get big into natural gas. So they came out with their green sustainability report, and they pledged to be net zero carbon emissions by 2050 or whatever, which is kind of the leading edge target. Like some European countries are pledging to be carbon neutral by 2050, and Biden probably will too. And Enbridge said they're going to do the same by 2050. Excuse me. And in their presentation, it was really fascinating because they're pretty dominant in the natural gas supply world. They're quite dominant in the oil transmission supply. Their transmission, they own a lot of pipelines which connect, for example, the oil sands in Canada right to U.S. refineries. They deliver natural gas on major trunk lines right to businesses and consumers. And they also have a lot of wind and solar, and they're playing with hydrogen as well. They built their first wind farm almost 18 years ago. So they've been at this for a long time, wind and solar. And they have offshore solar and onshore, or offshore wind and onshore wind, excuse me. So these guys have their finger in every pie. And they said, and so they invest wherever it's profitable. And so they're kind of agnostic about where their money goes. And so to me, they're the best, or one of the best groups to listen to, or organizations to listen to. If you want to talk about a transition, you have to talk to somebody who's actually involved in all aspects of it, because they understand it. And they said that it's been called a bridge. One of their executives said in their conference call, natural gas has been called the bridge fuel, and we agree, but it's an awfully long bridge. He said their contention is that natural gas is going to be dominant for many decades to come. These are like they have skin in every game here. So it's not like they're just saying this to discredit renewables, because they have a renewables business. they're just saying, no, this is the way it is. So, I think NextEra Energy is like a huge company down in the U.S., $140 billion market cap or something. They made the news because I think they got bigger than Exxon. And they're a very green company too. Lots of wind, lots of solar. But if I just went through their corporate presentation yesterday, excuse me, and they've got a huge reliance on natural gas as well. Excuse me. That's just the way it goes these days. Excuse me. I must be getting sick.
Well, we'll let you grab a glass of water quick and just taking a look at the time and everything. And I just wanted to ask you before we wrap up about layoffs. Are you guys experiencing layoffs up in Canada anywhere near like we are in the United States? I see Exxon last week, it was at 14,000 or something, I thought is what I read or heard. Talk to me about the workforce up there.
It's exactly the same, and we're actually been ahead of that curve. We've been having layoffs for years here. Probably about 4 or 5 years ago, the oil sector started shrinking, and there's been almost continuous layoffs. And when Exxon announces layoffs, they have a big arm up here in Canada too, so that hits them. Suncor is a big company up here. They've laid off a bunch of people. Almost all of the bigger companies have been laying off people pretty steadily. So, yeah, it's quite bad.
Well, how can people find your books and your blogs and your, well, you know, get you some holiday money, man. Let's figure out how we can funnel some money your way.
Kids got to eat. Thank you. So my book is called The End of Fossil Fuel Insanity, and it's like you said at the start, it's available at Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And pick up a copy or two. People really seem to like it. It's kind of written for the hardcore oil and gas crowd. I wrote it for people to give to people that are outside of the business, to say, here, if you want to understand what's going on in this crazy fossil fuel world, both sides of the argument, try to understand how we got to this place in this stalemate. That's who the book is aimed at, and people seem to like it because I've tried to break it down into something that makes sense to people outside the business. So. And then I also write columns, at the BOE Report.com, and my own website is Public Energy #1.